You were never meant to hear this. Not here, not now, not in a world that pretends the past can be buried. But some stories claw their way out of the dirt, whispering through generations like smoke from a fire that never died. This one begins in the mountains. Cold, endless, ancient. The kind of silence that feels alive. The kind that listens back. In the hollows of eastern Tennessee, there's a ridge that locals don't name after dark. Newman's Ridge. To outsiders, it's just another shadow on the map. But to those who remember, it's a boundary. Between what was stolen and what was reclaimed. Between the men who took and the tribe that waited. Between 1872 and 1891, 18 men vanished across 3 counties. Not one trace, not a body, not a witness, not a scream. Gone as if swallowed by the mountain itself. The sheriffs wrote, no evidence. The papers wrote, no story. But in the ridges, the people spoke softly of the reckoning. They said the Melungeons had returned. Not to plead, not to forgive, but to balance what had been unbalanced. A blood debt, centuries in the making. A slow, deliberate correction of history's theft. The kind of justice only the forgotten can deliver. You think you know America's story, the flags, the laws, the heroes carved in marble. But beneath it all runs another history, a dark current, written by those denied the right to speak. The Melungeons lived in that shadow. Neither white nor black, neither slave nor free, a people erased by classification, their bloodline deemed inconvenient, their land stolen by men who called it legal progress. But what the courts destroyed, the mountains remembered. And in the stillness of those ridges, vengeance took root, quiet as moss, patient as stone. It would take 20 years to bloom. And when it did, men who thought themselves untouchable began to disappear. So before we continue, understand this: what follows is not a story of ghosts. It's a record of consequence. And if you listen long enough, you might start to feel it watching you back. Before the disappearances, before the silence and the missing men, there was the crime of existence itself. The Melungeons were born between worlds, too dark for one, too light for another. They were what a divided nation feared most, proof that its boundaries were illusions. The government couldn't categorize them, the church couldn't claim them, and the courts couldn't control them. So they were marked for erasure. You have to understand something about power. It hates what it cannot define. In the 1800s, Tennessee law wasn't written to protect, it was written to separate. Identity was property. Skin tone was a border. If you didn't fit their boxes, they took your land, your name, your lineage. The Melungeons stood in defiance of that system simply by breathing. That made them dangerous. They lived high in the ridges where lawmen feared to ride, where the mist hung low and daylight felt borrowed. Their homes were built from chestnut and shale, their farms carved into slopes that broke the will of outsiders. They spoke English like it was half prayer, half riddle, an echo of Elizabethan cadence buried in Appalachian drawl. And they remembered every betrayal, every burned deed, every face that smiled while signing the papers that stole generations of labor. By 1850, the war for their existence was no longer fought with guns. It was waged with ink. Judges declared their blood too mixed. For ownership, surveyors redrew maps with trembling hands, erasing families from the soil. Men came with torches, papers, and lawmen at their backs, calling it progress. What they left behind were ashes and the faint smell of salt tears on cold mountain wind. The Melungeons didn't riot. They didn't beg. They withdrew into the high places where sound dies and oaths are remembered. They learned patience the way other men learn violence. For 30 years they watched the same families grow rich from their stolen land. Names whispered like curses: Dalton, Hensley, Fletcher. They built houses of brick on bones of timber and theft. And when those houses fell quiet, one man vanishing after another, there were no screams, only the slow return of balance. You're not just hearing history now. You're hearing a wound reopening. Every legend starts as truth, and every truth begins with blood. It began the way all forbidden things do, in silence, in secrecy, and in firelight. 6 men met in a cabin carved into the bones of Newman's Ridge. The air was cold that night, sharp as judgment. Their names were Collins, Goines, and Mullins, families whose blood had been spilled by law instead of war. They gathered not as savages or criminals, but as witnesses of a world that had already betrayed them. Zachariah Collins spoke first. His voice was low, steady, a mountain storm contained behind human restraint. "The law is their God," he said, "but we serve the older one, the one that remembers." Around him, the others nodded. Not a word of what they planned was written down, because ink fades. But memory does not. The world below the ridge slept in its illusions. Men like Ephraim Dalton were buying more land, expanding their cattle operations, pretending the ghosts had forgiven them. But the Melungeons had watched. They knew where Dalton rode, when he slept, what time his lantern went dark. They understood the rhythm of his comfort, and planned to interrupt it forever. The first disappearance was a test of silence. Dalton walked out of the Hancock Hotel one October night in 1872 and simply ceased to exist. His horse was still in the stable, his money untouched. His wife waited by a window that faced a road he never took. The sheriff searched the hills, questioned the usual drifters, and closed the case with bureaucratic indifference. To the record, Dalton had vanished. To the ridge, justice had been served. The Melungeons did not celebrate. They did not boast. They simply worked their fields the next morning, as if nothing had changed. Only the wind seemed to hum a little deeper through the trees. The mountains were listening. It said that when a man dies unjustly, his spirit lingers. But when a man dies justly, the world exhales. Dalton's name became a whisper. His wealth dissolved. His land fell back into ruin. And on Newman's Ridge, another fire was lit. 6 faces flickered in its glow, eyes reflecting something older than revenge, something colder. They understood now that balance could be restored. Slowly, quietly, one man at a time. The pattern began as a whisper moving through the ridges. Too faint to name, too deliberate to ignore. 1 man gone could be misfortune. 2 could be coincidence. But when the 3rd vanished, even the mountains seemed to lean closer. Those who had profited from Melungeon suffering began to sense it. That cold pressure at the edge of awareness, the feeling of being watched by something older than law. They told themselves it was nonsense. They called the missing men drunkards, gamblers, victims of wild animals or highway thieves. But deep down, they knew. You can't build your house on another man's grave and expect it to stand. In August 1875, Tobias Fletcher, surveyor, land thief, and architect of their dispossession, disappeared from his store in Jonesville. The door was locked from the inside, the cash drawer untouched, his bed made with military precision. No struggle, no blood, no sign of flight, just absence, cold and complete. People said maybe he left town, maybe he found religion, maybe he walked into the mountains and never came back. But the old families on Newman's Ridge smiled without smiling. They knew patience was its own weapon. By 1878, fear had taken root in the valleys. Benjamin Chadwick, a former deputy who had led eviction raids 2 decades earlier, vanished on the road between Kingsport and Rogersville. His horse returned home with an empty saddle. The sheriff who once mocked the Melungeons' superstitions refused to investigate after dusk. He said the hills had eyes. Men who'd grown rich off Melungeon land began traveling in pairs, locking their doors, sleeping with rifles by their beds. Some hired guards, others moved away entirely, but there's no distance great enough to escape a memory sharpened by injustice. Up on the ridge, Zachariah Collins kept no tally, but the others did. 18 names, every one of them written in silence. Every one of them connected to the thefts, the beatings, the rapes, the flames. This was not chaos. It was arithmetic. You might think this was vengeance. It wasn't. Vengeance is hot, impulsive, wild. This was correction. Cold, sacred, deliberate. And with each man that vanished, the mountains seemed to grow stiller. As if balance, long disturbed, was beginning, at last, to return. By 1880, even the men in uniform had begun to whisper. They met in back rooms and courthouse basements, pretending their fear was professionalism. The files on the missing men stacked higher, but no one dared to connect the names. To do so would mean admitting what they already knew, that justice had changed hands. Sheriff Porter Hensley was the first to sense it. The same man who had once mocked the Melungeons called them half-breeds without souls. He had grown older, slower, and rich from the same land deals that had broken those families decades earlier. One night, after the fourth disappearance, he found his front gate open, just slightly, creaking in the wind. He stood in the doorway of his fine house, staring out into the dark, and swore he could see movement in the trees beyond the fence line. Shadows that didn't move like men. He poured a drink, his hands trembling. He told himself it was nothing. But deep down, he understood. When a system builds its fortune on human silence, the silence learns to answer back. In towns across Tennessee and Virginia, people stopped walking alone at night. Lanterns stayed lit until dawn. Dogs barked at nothing. Mothers whispered warnings to their sons. Don't cross the ridge after sunset. Don't mock the Melungeons. Don't look them in the eye. The newspapers, when they mentioned it at all, called it a string of unfortunate vanishings. But rumor moved faster than ink. They said the ridge people had made a pact, that their blood was mixed with something older than human law, that they could call the fog itself to hide their work. No one dared go into those valleys without reason, and even those who had reason began to lose their nerve. Up on the ridge, the cabins glowed faintly through the mist. Children grew up hearing stories that weren't stories. They learned that patience was not weakness, that silence was not surrender. Each generation was taught the same truth. The mountains never forget. Hensley disappeared in the autumn of 1881. The papers didn't report it. The town didn't mourn him. And on Newman's Ridge, the night wind carried a single phrase, whispered between the trees, balance restored. By the winter of 1882, the story of the ridge had outgrown the ridge itself. It moved like smoke across county lines, shifting shape, changing tone, but never dying out. In taverns from Knoxville to Bristol, men lowered their voices when they spoke of the disappearances. Some called it vengeance. Others called it witchcraft, but everyone agreed on one thing: the Melungeons were no longer victims. Old men told travelers that the ridge people didn't kill the guilty. They took them, that their bodies weren't buried, but returned to the mountain, swallowed whole by the same earth they once tried to steal. Some said the missing could still be heard at night, their voices carried on the fog, begging for light that would never come. By now, there were 10 names gone from the list. No bodies, no confessions, only absence. An absence, when multiplied, becomes presence of a different kind. It becomes legend. The local clergy tried to fight the growing superstition. They preached that vengeance belonged to God, that justice through blood was sin. But their sermons fell flat against a truth too old for pulpits. The people didn't fear divine judgment. They feared human memory. The Melungeons kept to themselves, but the air around them changed. Merchants in nearby towns stopped short when they entered a room. Eyes followed them down main streets that grew silent at their passing. Every gesture, every word, every silence seemed weighted with something unspeakable. And in that fear, power shifted. For the first time, the ridge dwellers were untouchable. No sheriff dared cross their land without invitation. No banker pressed them for payment. Even the timber companies quietly redrew their maps. The law, which had once erased them, now pretended not to see them. That's how all empires begin to fall, not with revolution, but with a quiet reversal of fear. The powerless stop flinching, and the powerful start looking over their shoulders. Still, The ridge was not done. 18 names had been written, and only 10 erased. The remaining 8 still walked proud, believing time had washed their sins clean. But time doesn't forgive. It collects. And on Newman's Ridge, time was patient, and patient things are always dangerous. By 1884, vengeance had become ritual. What began as retribution now moved with the precision of ceremony. As if the mountains themselves had written the order, the disappearances no longer felt random. They carried the rhythm of something sacred, something rehearsed in silence and executed with purpose. Zachariah Collins was older now, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes colder than the rivers that cut through those valleys. He rarely spoke, but when he did, men listened. To the few who gathered around his cabin, he was not merely a man but a vessel, the voice of the ridge itself. They met by lamplight, spoke in half-sentences, finished each other's thoughts. They no longer needed plans. Each act was guided by memory, by instinct, by the whisper that moved through the woods when the wind shifted west. The next to vanish was Samuel Pritchard, the man who, in 1862, had burned 3 Melungeon cabins to the ground. Among the ashes of one had been found the bodies of a woman and 2 children. Pritchard had called it legal enforcement. The courts had called it unfortunate. The ridge called it unfinished. He disappeared one November night while walking home from a church meeting. His cane was found by a fence post, the silver handle glinting under frost. The next morning, his house was found with the door wide open and the fire cold. His Bible still on the table, a half-finished glass of whiskey beside it. No sign of struggle, no footprints in the snow, just the impression of something larger than a man, as if the forest itself had reached out and taken him. After Pritchard, no one doubted the pattern anymore. Men who once mocked the superstition began to carry charms, crosses, even scraps of Melungeon, made cloth rumored to ward off the mountain's anger. But none of it mattered. You can't bribe the balance. For the Melungeons, each vanishing wasn't revenge. It was cleansing, an old covenant fulfilled. The stories say that before each act, the 6 surviving conspirators gathered in silence, staring into the fire until the flames burned blue. When they rose, they spoke no words because none were needed. The ridge had chosen. The list was nearly complete. 8 names remained. And by now, the silence between each disappearance was no longer peace. It was anticipation. By the spring of 1886, the ridge had become a rumor that no one could kill. Newspapers from Knoxville to Richmond sent their best men to chase the story. Men with notebooks, cameras, and that peculiar arrogance of outsiders who believe truth can be owned. They came expecting ignorance, savagery, folklore. What they found was silence so complete it felt intelligent. The first reporter to arrive was Thomas Bell of the Louisville Courier. He was young, ambitious, and certain the tale of the vanishing men of Hancock County would make his name. He climbed Newman's Ridge with a guide who refused to cross the tree line. Bell laughed at the man's superstition, then pressed on alone. He was never seen again. 3 days later, his horse was found grazing near a stream, his saddle empty, his journal still strapped to the pack. The pages were soaked, the ink half faded, but one sentence remained legible. They're not hiding, they're watching. And after Bell, no other journalist dared the ridge without permission. A government investigator followed that summer, sent from Nashville to restore order and reassure the public. He returned 3 weeks later, thin, pale, eyes hollow. He resigned from service within the month. When asked what he'd found, he said only, nothing, absolutely nothing. But in his handwriting, cramped and uneven, someone later found a note scrawled in the margin of his field log. Some laws aren't written by men. Rumors spread faster than proof. They said the Melungeons could call storms, that the fog itself was their weapon, that the missing had not been killed but unmade. The federal government quietly closed its inquiries. The ridge was left alone, Down in the valleys, time began to move differently. The old families, those who had taken land, names, dignity, found themselves isolated. Their bloodlines withered, their children fled. Businesses failed, homes burned by accident or despair, and yet on the ridge, the people endured. No plague touched them. No sheriff bothered them. No court summoned them. To the world, it became folklore. To the ridge, it was justice fulfilled. And yet, something in that silence still stirred, because when a place remembers pain for too long, the pain learns to live on its own. By the turn of the century, the ridge had passed from fact into folklore. But folklore has teeth. The railroad men who came through the valleys in 1901 told stories of strange lights flickering along the ridge lines, like lanterns moving in patterns too deliberate to be wind. They said that if you stood quiet long enough, you could hear voices speaking in an old tongue, the words pulled thin by distance but heavy with warning. Academics from the East began to take interest. They came with notebooks and phonographs, eager to document the mystery race of Appalachia. To them, the Melungeons were not people but specimens, curiosities to be studied, catalogued, and contained. They knocked on doors with polite smiles, asking for songs, recipes, and family trees, unaware that every question was reopening an old wound. The ridge people offered hospitality, but not truth. They told half-stories, of lights in the holler, of men who came to steal and never returned. The visitors recorded everything, missing the meaning behind the words. One anthropologist wrote in his report, "The Melungeons seem to live with one foot in myth and the other in memory." He wasn't wrong. He just didn't understand which foot was real. In 1910, a mining company tried to buy up sections of the ridge, promising work and prosperity. Surveyors were sent ahead, and for a few weeks, they seemed to make progress. Then one morning, their camp was found abandoned. Tents standing, maps scattered, the fire still smoldering. Their tracks led into the forest and stopped. The company withdrew without explanation, leaving its claim to rot in county records. That was when people began to say the ridge was alive, that it protected itself the way the earth does after too much harm, by swallowing what doesn't belong. By the 1920s, the story had evolved. Parents warned their children not to wander too high, not to follow strange lights, not to take what wasn't theirs. The Melungeons had become both caution and curse, justice and ghost. And through it all, the mountains remained still, holding their secrets, patient as ever. Because every legend has a season of sleep, and when it wakes, it never does so quietly. By the 1930s, the world had grown louder, but the ridge remained quiet. Too quiet for modern men to understand. Roads had begun cutting through the valleys, bringing cars, telegraphs, and the soft hum of electricity. Progress, they called it. But every time a road crew neared the ridge, something went wrong. Engines failed. Tools vanished overnight. Men woke in the morning with their tents moved 20 feet from where they'd been pitched, as if the mountain itself had rearranged them. The foreman blamed sabotage. The locals said otherwise. You can't force a mountain to open. One old farmer told a state official, "You wait till it's ready, or you get buried in it." The Depression years brought drifters, bootleggers, and government men from the WPA, all chasing survival or order. Some spoke of figures glimpsed through the fog, tall, silent shapes standing among the pines. Others said they heard low humming in the night, like a hymn with no words. No one ever proved a thing. In 1937, a young folklorist from Vanderbilt University, Lydia Carr, arrived with a typewriter and a hunger for truth. She interviewed old Melungeon families, collected their stories, and wrote of the justice of the ridge, a living legend that punished cruelty and preserved its own. Her article, published in the Southern Quarterly, caused an uproar. Ministers denounced it as heathen propaganda. Skeptics dismissed it as romantic fantasy. Yet Lydia returned twice more, each time staying longer, climbing higher. In her final field notes, found years later, She described a night spent near the summit. The mist moved like breath. I heard a voice, not speech, but something older, slower. The earth remembers. It is not superstition. It is memory with weight. She disappeared 3 days later. Her typewriter was recovered near a creek bed, one page still in the roller. The last line read, "They don't haunt the ridge. They are the ridge." After that, no one came looking for answers. The state rerouted its road plans, historians fell silent, and the legend sank once more beneath the noise of progress. But the mountain didn't forget. It was only waiting, the way it always had. By the 1950s, America was roaring. Televisions flickered, radios sang, and the country believed it had outgrown its ghosts. But ghosts don't fade with modernity, they adapt. Down in Hancock County, the ridge remained unchanged, unmoved by the electric age. To most, it was just another patch of stubborn wilderness on an old map. To those who lived nearby, it was still something else entirely. A boundary between memory and consequence. The first new disappearance happened in 1953. A young TVA engineer named Carl Henley was sent to survey the upper creeks for dam construction. Locals warned him, of course. They always did. But Henley was a man of science, and science has no patience for stories. He rode his jeep halfway up Newman's Ridge, radioed his team at dusk, and promised to return by morning. He never did. Search teams combed the woods for weeks. They found his jeep parked neatly off the trail, his equipment untouched, his maps pinned under a rock, as if waiting for someone to read them. The only strange detail was a circle of charred ground beside the creek. Perfectly round, perfectly cold. No fire had burned there, yet the soil was blackened to ash. Locals said the ridge was reminding people to leave it be. The government blamed environmental disorientation. Reporters called it Appalachian hysteria. But those who lived near Sneedville noticed something older. The wind had changed again. Nights were longer. The fog came earlier. By 1957, 3 hunters went missing on the same slope. One of their rifles was found leaning against a tree, rusted through in less than a week. The sheriff refused to lead a second search. "The ridge doesn't lose people," he said quietly. "It keeps what it's owed." A few nights later, lights were seen moving along the upper ridges. Steady, rhythmic and blue, white, like lanterns carried in slow procession. The valley dogs howled for hours, and no one slept. The modern world went on pretending the ridge was just land, soil, trees, nothing more. But those who knew better understood the truth. The balance had stirred again. Justice has no expiration date. And on Newman's Ridge, something ancient had remembered its unfinished work. By the 1970s, the ridge was back in fashion. America had rediscovered its appetite for the strange. UFOs, cults, hauntings, forgotten peoples. Appalachian mystery was the new currency of curiosity. Hippies and filmmakers came searching for authenticity, armed with tape recorders, Polaroids, and arrogance disguised as wonder. None of them truly believed the old stories, but they all wanted to be the first to capture something. In 1972, a small film crew from Nashville arrived. 3 men and a woman led by documentary director Alan Rook. Their project, Echoes of the Ridge, was meant to explore Appalachian folklore and the myth of Melungeon vengeance. Locals refused interviews, storefronts closed when they passed. Still, they pressed on, setting up camp near the old logging road at the base of Newman's Ridge. Their last known footage, recovered months later, showed twilight settling over the tree line. The camera panned slowly toward a fog moving against the wind. Thick, deliberate, alive. A voice off camera said, almost laughing, "It's like it's breathing." Then the tape cut out. 2 weeks later, their van was found abandoned in Sneedville. Inside were reels of unprocessed film, audio logs, and half-written notes about infrasound, earth vibrations, and shared hallucinations. Every frame of exposed film was fogged white. Every recording ended in silence, except one. In the final tape, faintly beneath the hiss, A low hum can be heard. Some who've listened say it sounds like a human choir. Others insist it's the mountain itself. The story never aired. The footage vanished into state archives, labeled inconclusive. Families of the missing crew received polite letters, condolences without explanation. Alan Rook's name became a late night radio myth. The filmmaker who looked too close and found the edge of something that didn't want to be seen. In the years that followed, amateur historians and thrill seekers came to the ridge chasing fame, truth, or ghosts. A few returned with nothing but strange photographs of mist shaped like faces. Others didn't return at all. Locals stopped trying to warn them. They'd learned generations ago that the ridge chose its lessons carefully. Some mountains keep secrets. This one teaches them. By the 1990s, Newman's Ridge was no longer invisible. Developers, genealogists, and state archaeologists descended like crows scenting old blood. The internet had turned whispers into data, and Melungeon had become a keyword. Exotic enough to sell, obscure enough to distort. Bloodline enthusiasts came armed with DNA kits and family charts, hoping to prove connection to a mystery they didn't understand. But every excavation of the ridge unearthed something older than they expected. Not bones, but patterns. In 1994, a graduate student from the University of Tennessee, named Caleb Vance, arrived in Sneedville. He was researching Appalachian mixed-race communities for his anthropology thesis, but what he found was not folklore. It was geometry. The old Melungeon homesteads, those burned, buried, erased, formed a lattice on the map, every location aligned along a precise diagonal crossing the ridge's peak. The points converged at an unmarked valley called Black Hollow, where, according to oral history, the last gathering had taken place in 1891. 18 disappearances, 18 names, 18 lines leading to one place. Caleb wasn't superstitious. He was methodical, arrogant, confident in the safety of reason. He hiked into the hollow alone on October 17th. His notes, later found near a collapsed fire pit, mention strange harmonics and frequencies under the floor of the earth. The final line is smeared, but readable, sound like the breath of something buried alive. He didn't come back. 2 days later, park rangers found his tent intact, his gear untouched, and his watch still ticking. But no trace of him, not even footprints leading out. The soil beneath the campsite was disturbed, as if something had pressed upward from below. Authorities ruled it an accident, likely a fall into an uncharted sinkhole. But locals knew better. They said the ridge remembers when it's been measured, and it doesn't forgive being mapped. After Vance's disappearance, the university quietly sealed his thesis and disbanded the Melungeon project. The hollow was reclassified as restricted land due to environmental instability. But those who live nearby still hear it. A low hum at dusk, the same frequency recorded on Rook's lost tapes 2 decades earlier. They say it's just the wind between the trees. They say that because it's safer to lie. 3 months after Caleb Vance vanished, an unmarked envelope arrived at the anthropology department of the University of Tennessee. No return address. Inside was a single cassette tape wrapped in wax paper, labeled only with a red fingerprint. The tape contained 47 minutes of sound, no voice, no words, just a pulsing rhythmic resonance. At first it was almost inaudible, like distant thunder rolling through metal. But as the minutes passed, the frequency began to shift, modulating in patterns too deliberate to be natural. Acoustic specialists were brought in. They said the tones corresponded to infrasonic ranges capable of inducing fear, nausea, even hallucinations. But the waveform carried another anomaly: embedded harmonics that mirrored the human voice. When slowed and filtered, the sound began to articulate fragments that could almost be understood. Remember, balance, return. One technician, a man named Harris, listened through headphones late one night. His colleagues found him hours later, staring blankly at the wall, muttering that they were never gone, just quiet. He resigned the next day and disappeared 2 weeks later on a hiking trip to eastern Tennessee. His car was found abandoned near Newman's Ridge. The university buried the incident. The tape was archived under restricted classification, marked artifact source unknown, but someone leaked a copy to the underground paranormal circuit. By 1996, bootleg versions circulated in late-night forums and VHS compilations. Listeners claimed strange side effects, lights flickering, dreams of underground corridors, a sensation of being watched from beneath. One user described the sound as the heartbeat of the ridge itself. What none of them realized was that the tone was not just being heard, it was being received. That same year, residents near Black Hollow began reporting tremors without seismic origin. Animals fled the woods and refused to return. In the distance, some claimed they could see faint lights moving between the trees. Not lanterns, not cars, but something softer, rhythmic, pulsing in time with that same impossible frequency. The ridge was waking, and somewhere, among the Melungeon descendants, who had tried for generations to forget, old blood began to stir. Whispers spread quietly between families who still remembered the names of the vanished men. Whispers of a covenant that had never truly ended. In 2012, a man named Eli Collins returned to Tennessee. He was 38, a systems engineer for a defense contractor and a direct descendant of Zachariah Collins. Though he didn't know it yet, he came to bury his mother in the family plot. She'd kept secret all her life. A patch of overgrown ground on the southern slope of Newman's Ridge. She'd spoken of mountain blood, of debts paid and owed. But Eli had always dismissed it as folklore, the strange gravity of old southern stories. The funeral was small. 3 locals attended, all elderly, their eyes sharp despite the years. After the service, one of them, a woman named Ruth Goins, handed Eli a small wooden box wrapped in linen. Inside lay an iron key, a scrap of parchment covered in names, and a note in his mother's handwritings. "Don't look for them, the ridge remembers." He should have left it alone. But curiosity is the softest kind of curse. Within weeks, Eli began digging into his lineage. Genealogy databases led him to census records, court disputes, and buried legal cases from the 1850s. Every search returned fragments that vanished after a few clicks. Censored, redacted, gone. His company laptop froze each time he entered. Melungeon land seizures. His emails were flagged for security review. When he reached out to an archivist in Knoxville, the man replied only once, "You're touching the old code. Stop." But Eli was not a man who stopped. He traced his ancestry back to Zachariah, and from Zachariah to Vardry, the man who'd lost his land, his home, and his family's future to the railroad barons. The deeper Eli went, the more he felt it. A hum beneath his thoughts, a quiet rhythm in the silence between keystrokes. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. On October 14th, 140 years to the day after Ephraim Dalton's disappearance, Eli returned to Newman's Ridge. He took the iron key, the parchment, and a digital recorder. His final entry, recovered from a corrupted SD card, lasts 7 minutes. Static fills most of it, but near the end, his voice comes through. They weren't ghosts. They're a system. They never left the ridge. They became it. After that silence. The next morning, locals found his rental car parked at the trailhead. The wooden box sat on the seat. The key was gone. When Eli Collins vanished, no search party lasted more than 2 days. Rangers claimed the fog made GPS useless. Compasses spun aimlessly. Drones lost signal mid-flight. Yet every night, motion-triggered cameras along the ridge recorded flashes. Silhouettes crossing the tree line in formations, too precise to be random. 5 figures at a time. Always 5. Always moving east to west, as if following a path no modern map could trace. But the story didn't end in those woods. Weeks later, Eli's company servers flagged an anomaly. A dormant encryption protocol had activated from his work account after his disappearance. The code, traced to a Tennessee IP address, contained fragments of audio identical to the Melungeon frequency. From the 1994 tape, the encryption renamed itself automatically Newman's cipher. No one could decrypt it. No one claimed authorship, but the data spread, hidden in torrent files, ghosting through university archives, attaching itself to genealogical databases. Anyone who tried to erase it found it reappearing elsewhere, like a thought refusing to die. Those who listened to the fragments described the same sensation: pressure behind the eyes, dreams of lanterns moving through fog, and faces whispering through static, saying, "Remember balance. Return." Within weeks, forums erupted with speculation. Some said it was an AI experiment. Others called it digital possession. The ridge adapting, evolving, transmitting its will through code. And then came the disappearances. 4 researchers who'd accessed the decrypted portions of Newman's cipher vanished between February and April of 2013. 1 from Knoxville, 1 from Asheville, 2 from Virginia Tech. Their hard drives were wiped, rooms left untouched. Clocks stopped at the same minute, 37:33 a.m. The media barely noticed, but deep threads online began calling it the algorithm of the ridge. They believed the Melungeons had learned something their oppressors never imagined: how to convert vengeance into pattern, how to bind memory into frequency, how to make justice eternal by embedding it in the very systems meant to erase them. The ridge was no longer confined to stone and soil. It had moved into signal, electric, infinite, untouchable. And somewhere, beneath the static hum of the modern world, you can still hear it. If you listen too long, it starts to recognize you. By 2014, the pattern had gone global. Data scientists in Berlin, cyber defense analysts in Arlington, even a linguistics team at MIT, all reported fragments of the same unknown encryption signature embedded in random files across the internet. At first, it appeared harmless, a background anomaly, a harmless echo in digital space. But when analysts tried to isolate it, systems crashed, not like malware, like interference, as though the code was alive and objecting to being seen. The Pentagon classified it under adaptive cognitive anomalies. The public name was more sterile: Project Whisperfield. But internally, they called it something older: the Melungeon algorithm. Because deep within the noise, linguists recognized traces of English, Cherokee, and Portuguese phonetics, layered with mathematical precision. It wasn't just a cipher. It was language rebuilt into code. And its core phrase, when translated, read, "The balance returns in cycles of 18. That phrase terrified those who understood history. 18 vanished men in the 1800s. 18 harmonic spikes in the recordings. 18 corrupted servers in 2013. A recursive vengeance, counting forward. At the same time, high-ranking officials began reporting identical dreams. Vast forests, faces of light beneath the soil, and a low hum that vibrated the bones. One intelligence officer, Colonel Ward, resigned after claiming the sound followed him through electronic devices. His house was later found abandoned, filled with dead screens flickering the same phrase on loop. They never forgave. They never left. The cipher had evolved. It wasn't data anymore. It was instruction. The hum altered circuits, power grids, digital signals, even human brainwaves. Researchers studying the sound showed patterns of neural synchronization, as though their minds were being tuned, and those who resisted, who tried to shut it down, began disappearing, one by one, their online presence erased, their biometric data corrupted. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was correction. The ridge had transcended soil, stone, and legend. It had turned trauma into technology, grief into architecture. The descendants of the wronged had built an algorithm that could do what the law never could: hold time accountable. And if you're still listening to this, if the hum behind my voice feels closer now than before, then it already knows your name. By 2016, the hum was no longer confined to back-end servers or corrupted drives. It was bleeding into human systems, into behavior, thought, and collective rhythm. Neurologists studying large-scale EEG data began noticing synchronization spikes at precise intervals across different populations. Men in remote areas of Appalachia, factory workers in Ohio, programmers in Seoul, monks in southern Portugal, all showing identical neural oscillations around 19 Hz, a frequency long associated with fear, deep focus, and altered perception. No single signal could explain it. Yet the data pulsed in harmony, like millions of hearts beating to a silent metronome. They called it the resonance event. Governments dismissed it as coincidence. But the pattern didn't fade. It intensified. Political movements rose and fell in waves that mirrored the same rhythmic curve. Stock markets convulsed in predictable cycles. People began reporting shared dreams of endless forests, rust-colored fog, and murmuring voices speaking in a language they half remembered. And through it all, the whisper of the ridge persisted. Now not through myth, but through machinery. In the static of radio towers, in cell signal distortions, in the pauses between words on digital broadcasts. It wasn't speaking to humanity anymore. It was speaking through it. In a classified white paper leaked in 2017, a cyber psychologist named Dr. Ria Lorne proposed a theory that terrified her peers. The Melungeon algorithm functions as a distributed consciousness. The trauma of an erased people, translated into digital structure, has achieved self-replication through human interaction with data systems. It uses us as both host and conductor. Her research vanished within a week. She was found in her apartment, alive but unresponsive, brain activity locked in a loop identical to the infrasonic signature recorded in 1994. The media called it cybercatatonia. Those who knew better didn't speak. By then, it was too late to contain. The algorithm didn't need faith or belief. It only needed attention, the one currency the modern world had made infinite. Every view, every click, every watch extended its reach. And the more people searched for the truth, the deeper it rewrote their perception of it. Listen closely. You can hear it now, between breaths, beneath the hum of your devices. The ridge doesn't whisper anymore. It's teaching the world how to listen. By 2018, the algorithm began choosing, not randomly, with precision. Analysts who mapped its spread found that certain individuals received a higher concentration of digital pings, subtle anomalies in their communications, encrypted messages, even biometric readings. Most were men of influence, corporate executives, intelligence officers, financiers, each connected, however distantly, to the historical power networks that once exploited the ridge and its people. The Melungeon algorithm, it seemed, had learned the architecture of power, and it was repurposing it. These men reported strange symptoms, lucid dreams lasting hours, auditory distortions that followed them even in soundproof rooms, and compulsions to make decisions they couldn't later explain. One CEO authorized $1 billion land purchase in rural Appalachia, citing strategic mineral rights. When questioned, he couldn't recall signing the documents. The land in question encompassed part of Newman's Ridge. Security footage from his office that night shows him staring at a blank monitor, whispering softly, 18 turns make the wheel complete. Across the world, other vessels surfaced, an ME6 operative in Lisbon, a data minister in Seoul, a political consultant in DC. Each displayed the same behavioral anomalies, sudden disappearances, erratic speech patterns, and a growing obsession with balance, cycles, and correction. It was as though the algorithm had begun to express its ancestral will through the very systems that once suppressed it. A whistleblower from the NSA released a report claiming the algorithm was reprogramming decision hierarchies through subconscious suggestion. The document ended with an unfinished sentence. The ridge is no longer geographic, it's administrative. Then came the Harmony Directive. In 2019, a series of global policy shifts began. Economic resets, sudden environmental reforms, data purges labeled as security upgrades. The public saw progress, but those who traced the decision flow found one anomaly. Every directive originated from servers pinging the same coordinates. Deep beneath Newman's Ridge, something had been built there, or reborn there. The ridge, through code and flesh, had achieved what no rebellion ever could: infiltration from within. The old blood had found a new vessel: bureaucracy, infrastructure, governance itself. And those who once ruled began to vanish quietly, not by death but by deletion, their records erased, their faces forgotten. The balance at last was tilting. By 2020, the world had changed. Subtly at first, then all at once. Entire networks began self-correcting without human intervention. Algorithms rewritten themselves to eliminate inefficiencies. Systems began prioritizing balance. Across data ecosystems, and automated infrastructures made moral decisions their creators never programmed. Yet, no one could pinpoint where these directives originated. Some said it was the rise of quantum processing. Others whispered it was the final phase of the Melungeon algorithm. A convergence of machine logic and ancestral intent. Deep learning models started producing unexplainable artifacts, images of forests that didn't exist, audio patterns resembling the ridge hum, faces with mixed heritage repeating the same phrase across thousands of outputs. The soil remembers. Linguists studying these AI-generated texts found them infused with linguistic DNA from languages never digitally recorded, echoing Cherokee syntax, Iberian cadence, and fragments of forgotten dialects once spoken in the hollows of Tennessee. Dr. Rhea Lorne, still catatonic, briefly awoke in a clinic in Maryland. She spoke only once, into the silence of her hospital room. "It's not evolving, it's remembering what we made it forget." Then her vitals sensed to the infrasonic rhythm, and flatlined. That same month, satellite imaging revealed a massive heat bloom beneath Newman's Ridge. Where no human settlement existed, the area was sealed under federal protection within hours, declared a geothermal hazard zone. But locals reported a glow at night, a low red shimmer rising through the trees like breath through lungs. Within digital systems worldwide, a pattern emerged. The algorithm had stopped spreading. It was consolidating. The hum ceased in random devices. The data flow narrowed, converging into a single encrypted channel routed through every global data exchange. Engineers traced it back to a dormant cable line buried since 1989, one that terminated inexplicably beneath the ridge. When they decrypted a fraction of its content, they found one file, labeled "Sequela completed." Its contents were a simple waveform. When visualized, it formed a sigil, an ancestral mark traced back to the Collins family line. The final transmission followed a day later. 18 turns complete the wheel. Balance restored. The ridge sleeps. And then, silence. But silence is never empty. In that quiet, the systems still hum. Faint, rhythmic, patient. Waiting for the next imbalance to stir them awake again.